finish what you started, you came to the right place. Them girls that you came with, you might have to part with. Depending on how this thing shakes. Wauwatosa, Kenosha, Oconomowoc is in the house. And if
we are lucky to be joined by Professor Matthew Kroenig, who's going to help us take a new look at great power competition, U.S. foreign policy, and all manner of things. Matt, should I call you Dr. Matthew, Matt? Do you have a nickname? What's your preferred nomenclature?
You know, I've Supreme Allied Commander, I thought always had a nice ring to it.
Okay, I can do that. Sack?
Either that or Matt is fine.
Seriously, have you ever had a nickname growing up? Kroenig, I imagine it took me about 5 years to learn how to pronounce it the correct way. Did that spawn any interesting nicknames when you were a child?
Yeah, you know, my name's spelled phonetically, it would be like Kroenig. I guess it's a German family originally. My German friends say it would be pronounced more like Kroenig in Germany. But my mom says it's pronounced Kroenig, and I believed her. So that was my nickname, actually, in high school, Kroenig.
I was always just Gallagher, too, which I thought was pretty uninspired and thought there was a better nickname lurking there. Well, tell us, Matt, where are you from originally, and when did you first get interested in foreign policy?
Well, I'm a nice guy from the Midwest, too. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. And, you know, actually, I thought I was going to be the next Michael Jordan. I'm watching Last Dance on ESPN, like many. And, you know, it was a very good high school basketball player, played 1 year of Division III basketball at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. And then, you know, realized I probably didn't have an NBA career in store and was trying to figure out what to do with my life. And I did a study abroad program called Semester at Sea, where we took a cruise around the world and we stopped in 10 countries in 3 months. And so I got really interested in international affairs and thought that would be a pretty cool career path to focus on international politics and U.S. foreign policy.
So there's so much there I want to talk about. But first of all, I'm seeing you as either a shooting guard or a small forward. Am I right?
Shooting guard. I was deadly from 3-point. That was all I had. I shot over 50%, though, from behind the arc. So that's
which back before it was cool to shoot a bunch of 3-pointers, which is so funny. I mean, my wife and I are watching The Last Dance as well, which is amazing. But it's amazing how much the game has changed at the NBA since the days of MJ, and now we're in sort of like the Steph Curry world and the role of 3-pointers in NBA game now. But I don't know why it is so interesting to me. I don't know if it just is revived all of my love for the NBA when I was a child, but we are absolutely loving this show.
Yeah, for me, I think it's nostalgia. You know, I had Michael Jordan posters in my basement and used to stick my tongue out when I played. And as a kid, my dad told me I was going to bite it off if I kept that up. But wasn't in it for me, though. You know, I could make 3-pointers when there was nobody in my face, but you know, in the college game, when you had taller people, it just wasn't going to work.
So you made that classic transition from basketball to foreign policy and academia. Well, also Fulton, Missouri, if I remember correctly, was the site of the famous Iron Curtain speech by Winston Churchill. What's Fulton, Missouri like?
Well, you know, it's interesting. Actually, he gave that speech in Fulton's gym. So I played dozens of basketball games in the gym where Churchill gave the Iron Curtain speech. And there's a big chunk of the Berlin Wall still in Fulton, Missouri. Fulton, Missouri wasn't an exciting place to be, even as an 18-year-old on a college campus. So I ended up transferring to the big state school the next year. I went to University of Missouri and finished my university studies there. And, you know, Missouri's a good place to be from, but I'm also enjoying what I'm doing now in Washington.
Wait, so quickly back to The Last Dance, which I actually just sort of want to do this entire podcast about The Last Dance now. But do you have strong feelings on the Michael Jordan versus LeBron debate?
I mean, pretty strong. I mean, how many championships does Jordan have and how many does LeBron have? So, you know, I think, you know.
I think the other thing about that documentary is there's so many characters that I forgot at the NBA at that time. Like Gary Payton was on the last episode. Gary Payton is awesome. An all-time just trash talker, great defender. I love Gary Payton. Okay, I'm going to stop talking about The Last Dance. So how did you go directly from undergrad into graduate school? How did you think about how did your general interest in foreign policy translate into a specific interest in getting a PhD in academia?
It's funny looking back. I was so naive because I was a junior in college and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And I thought foreign policy was interesting, but I was in Missouri. My parents weren't in foreign policy. I didn't know anything about it, but I knew who Henry Kissinger was. And so I thought, I'll just do what Kissinger did. I'll do a PhD in political science. I'll become a tenured international relations professor, and then I'll be national security advisor. That seems good.
And Secretary of State and that's right. I'll just do a Kissinger too.
Yeah. I wanted to be Jordan. That didn't work out. So Kissinger was next best thing. And I wasn't even an international relations major for university. So I needed to apply for graduate schools and got U.S. News and World Reports. And they ranked the best PhD programs in international politics. So I just applied to a bunch of the best programs. Harvard was number 1 and I didn't get in. But Berkeley was number 2 and I got in. And so I said, okay, good enough. I'll move to California and do a PhD at UC Berkeley.
Well, Harvard sucks and it's a den of communist sympathizers anyway. So that's nothing to be ashamed of. What was the department at Berkeley? And I assume you were an IR specialist within government. Was it very quantitative at that time? And talk a little bit about this divide within the field between people that are more quantitatively oriented versus those that are qualitatively oriented. And how did you yourself approach that pressure to run everything through a Stata regression?
Yeah, well, I went to graduate school in politics because I was interested in contemporary politics, and I was also interested in history and a little bit in political philosophy, and I kind of thought that's what I was getting into. And then, as your question points out, modern political science has really become more scientific, has economics or physics envy a little bit, trying to collect big data sets, run statistical analyses, game theory. And so I was kind of forced into going down that route because that's the way the field is going. At first, I was doing it just because I thought I had to get by. But over time, I have become convinced that there is some value to doing quantitative analysis in politics, to doing game theory in politics. And so from that point to the present, my research has always combined a little bit of kind of historical research, political theory, but also the more quantitative approaches.
How did you wind up at Georgetown? And then how do you personally approach bridging the gap between academia and policy in your own career?
Well, it's interesting because when I started the PhD program, I was pretty naive. As you and maybe many of the viewers know, there are many people who do PhDs because they dream of becoming tenured professors. I dreamed of becoming Secretary of State, and I thought the way to do that was to get a PhD in political science, which I now know is not the case. And so I was always interested in policy. And so one summer from Berkeley, I had the opportunity to do an internship at the Central Intelligence Agency, which was great. And then the next summer, I did an internship at the strategy office in the Pentagon, and also had a very good experience. And the whole time, my professors at Berkeley were saying, why are you wasting your time at the Pentagon? You should be going to stats camp at the University of Michigan, owning your political science skills. So I was always interested in kind of bridging the gap. So when I finished the PhD at Berkeley, I went on the academic job market. And as you know, it's very competitive. People apply for basically every professorship in the world and hope that they get something. And so my plan was that if I got a good job, Georgetown or something, I would take it. But if I didn't get a good job, I would just go back to Washington and work at the Pentagon or something like that. And I was very fortunate. I had a number of good offers, including from schools that are arguably better than Georgetown, a couple of Ivy League schools. But I thought to be in Washington, D.C., to work at Georgetown for the issues that I care about, there was really nothing better. So took that job, and I've been there for 12 years now.
What was your dissertation that presumably was the subject of your job talk back then, and how does that relate to your current research?
Well, It goes back to when I started graduate school. I started August 2001. And as you might remember, something happened in September 2001. So I actually started graduate school thinking I was going to do European political economy. It would be a good excuse to go to Europe in the summers and drink Italian wine. And then suddenly September 11th happened, and many people were saying, my God, what if bin Laden had had nuclear weapons? What if instead of planes flying into the World Trade Center, he had detonated nuclear weapons in New York? And so people were saying, could he get nuclear weapons? Who would give him nuclear weapons? And I became interested in that. We didn't have any evidence of countries ever helping terrorists with nuclear weapons, but we did have evidence of countries helping other countries with nuclear weapons. And so I thought if I could understand that, that might tell us something about terrorist nuclear acquisition. So I did my PhD dissertation on why countries help other countries build nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union helped China, China helped Pakistan, et cetera, et cetera. And so I've been working on nuclear strategy, defense strategy, great power politics ever since.
Like the great Kissinger and Bernard Brody before you. So
that was Kissinger's first book as well, Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy.
So why do countries help other countries acquire nuclear technology?
It's a good question. When I started the research, many people said, well, of course, it's about money. They'd export anything in order to earn hard currency. But that's not what I found. It's more of a realist power politics explanation. In fact, the title of my dissertation was "The Enemy of My Enemy is My Customer." So basically, countries are willing to help other countries build nuclear weapons if it poses bigger problems for them than it does, or for their enemies than it does for them. So Soviet Union helped China to cause problems for the United States. China helped Pakistan to cause problems for India. France helped Israel. France, not the United States, some people find that interesting, helped Israel to cause problems for Egypt. So there's kind of a balance of power logic to it.
Interesting. Well, so before we get more into your research, just quickly, as you look back on your own career, were there particular mentors that were important in helping you along, or to this day that you look to as mentors and ask for advice when you're navigating different decisions?
Definitely, and I think that's important for people who, in any field really, to have good mentors. So when I was actually at the University of Missouri, I had one of the deans. I was thinking about applying to master's programs, and he said, "Well, you're smart enough just to apply to a PhD program, and if you get in, they'll pay for you to go. They'll pay your tuition and provide you a stipend." So that was important. At UC Berkeley, I had a professor who was doing advising for the Central Intelligence Agency. He helped me get that first internship. Of course, when you go on the academic job market, you have to have people write you letters of recommendation. And to this day, there are mentors at Georgetown, mentors at the Atlantic Council think tank, where I have an affiliation, who I go to for advice and ask them about next steps in my career. So mentorship is very important, I think, for success.
Would it be fair to say, I mean, you've advised various Republican presidential campaigns. I think people would identify you as a conservative foreign policy thinker. Has there been any backlash to that in an academic environment, which, let's say, tends to be not conservative?
The short answer is yes. Fortunately, I think political science is often so divorced from the hot issues of the day that you can do political science research without really coming out of the closet and revealing yourself as conservative or liberal. And if you're doing a PhD at Berkeley, most people just assume you're liberal anyway. So I think really until I almost had tenure at Georgetown that my colleagues suspected that I might be conservative. I wrote an article for Foreign Affairs magazine advocating for the military option on Iran. And I think many of my colleagues at Georgetown were kind of struck by that. But fortunately, my academic record was so good at that point that they couldn't deny me tenure. But there have been, to be serious, there were incidents of discrimination over the years. It is a hostile place for conservatives.
Why do you think that is, though? I mean, just as a phenomenon, is there sort of a groupthink involved? Why is there this bias in academia?
It's a good question. As a good scholar, I'll say there are two hypotheses. The one hypothesis is that conservatives prefer not to go into academia or journalism, that they're more interested in making money or political influence or other things. And so they see, earning, a small salary to teach at a liberal arts college or a small salary to write for a newspaper is not something they want to do. So one answer is there's a selection effect that conservatives don't go into the academy in the first place. The other explanation is that there is discrimination against conservatives, and there is a lot of evidence against this. There was one good experiment done where professors were given two different resumes to hire for a position, and one self-identified as a conservative, and the professors rated the conservative as less intelligent and said that they wouldn't hire him, and were willing to hire the progressive with the exact same resume.
Interesting. So there's a whole little subfield that explores these various hypotheses. Okay, so getting back to your research, you wrote an article that I believe became a book about the need to attack Iran. When did that come out? And talk a little bit about how you were involved in trying to shape the conversation on Iran in the sort of latter part of the Obama administration.
Yeah, well, one of the great things about teaching international politics at Georgetown is that I'm in Washington, D.C., so there are a lot of opportunities to work on presidential campaigns, to advise at the Pentagon and the intelligence community. So I did a one-year Council on Foreign Relations fellowship at the Pentagon, 2010 to 2011, and I worked on the Iran desk. And at the time, you had people like Fareed Zakaria on CNN saying, diplomacy with Iran's not going to work. We're going to face this terrible decision between either letting Iran have nuclear weapons or bombing Iran. And of course, we can't bomb Iran, so the solution is to just let them have nuclear weapons. But then working on the Iran desk for a year, I realized that many of the assumptions people were making on the outside just weren't true. We did have viable options to destroy Iran's nuclear program. It could set the program back many years. Iran's options for retaliating weren't pretty, but in my view, were less bad than living with a nuclear-armed Iran forever. And so I was working on memos and briefings on this subject for high-level government officials inside the Pentagon. And so when I left, I pitched an article to Foreign Affairs on the same point, saying that we should try diplomacy with Iran, but if it fails, destroying their program is better than letting them have nukes. And it created all kinds of controversy. There was a New York Times editorial about how I was a bad person, and a lot of outcry. But
did they actually attack you personally, or did they attack your argument at all?
Yeah, it was a columnist for the New York Times mentioned me by name, and said what a terrible proposal this was, and that my colleagues thought I was crazy. And
it's like an anonymous quote from one of your colleagues, just savaging you.
Well, I wrote a letter to the editor back disputing that point, because it was Obama administration officials who were asking me to do these papers and PowerPoint slides in government, and I just basically made some of the same arguments publicly that I'd been making privately.
So when did the book come out?
Oh, so the article came out in 2012, and then I worked hard on the book, given the interest, and the book came out in 2014. So actually just before we struck the nuclear deal with Iran.
Interesting. So very well timed, but I think it's fair to say at that time, I was of the opinion that the Middle East was the most important theater geopolitically in the world, and I was a aspiring Arabist and Middle East specialist. And now I look back on that almost as a naive view, given that all we talk about these days is China. When did you start to, given how involved you were in the Iran debate, when did you start to ask these bigger questions about our competition with China?
It was probably the 2008 financial crisis when I really started thinking about it, because if you'll remember, then after the end of the Cold War, many people were saying, well, of course, the United States has the best system. democracy, capitalism. We beat the communists. And then in 2008, some people started to say, well, wait a second, we didn't do so well. China appears to have done better. Maybe this kind of state-led authoritarianism model is better than our model of open markets in politics. And so I became interested in that and wanted to start researching that, and actually presented a paper on that at the American Political Science annual conference in 2010 or 2011 or so. And so this was my first kind of foray into the US-China democracy versus autocracy debate. And then I got sidelined by other things, Iran, working on the 2016 presidential campaign, and then just came back to this book a couple of years ago. So in some ways, the book is, it's a good thing I was late, because it's more relevant now in some ways than it was a decade ago.
Very relevant now. You're just quick technical note here. You're frozen on my screen. Are you frozen on your screen?
I'm not, no.
Okay. Well, what I might do, because if I stop recording, we'll still have the video up to this point, and I'll just start recording again. How does that work? Let's see if that fixes it. A break for our sponsor. This podcast is brought to you by The Last Dance, ESPN's The Last Dance. Just kidding. I'm not taking any sponsorships. Not allowed. Okay. So you had written this paper in 2010, basically comparing autocracies or China to the United States. Now this research question reemerges almost a decade later. Basically frame the puzzle that as you see it, that is the subject of your book.
Well, as you and your viewers probably know, the national
hundreds of viewers. I mean,
millions,
millions maybe.
Yeah. The national security strategy from 2017, the national defense strategy from 2018 says the return of great power competition with Russia and China, but really with China, is the greatest threat facing the country. And many people seem to be pretty pessimistic about where we are. They say, China has this autocratic system. President Xi can pull a lever and get things done, make big investments in artificial intelligence and other things. Meanwhile, we're dysfunctional, we're gridlocked, we have these internal debates. And I was skeptical of that for a variety of reasons. And so my new book argues that actually democracies have the advantage in great power competition. That democracies like the United States tend to be better in economic growth and technology innovation, better at international finance, better at building alliances, better in military matters. And so China does have some strengths, but its weaknesses outweigh those. And so even though the United States has some problems, our fundamentals are still better than Russia's and China's. And so I think the United States will do quite well in this new era of great power competition, and will remain the leading state for years to come.
So let's dig into those fundamentals. This is something I've become obsessed with, something that I call the Macarthur Curve, because where is it? I should have gotten this book before I started this, but here we go. All right. So if you read William Manchester's biographer of Douglas MacArthur, who is a Wisconsinite who has flaws, he's got this great moment on the eve of World War II where he's having a debate that is your book in the Philippines with this chief of staff, and basically about whether we should suspend Congress in wartime in order to win. And MacArthur, somewhat ironically, defends democracy and says, no, we shouldn't do that because autocracies start off good, right? They can do big, bold things quickly, but then friction happens and they don't know how to improvise. Whereas we start off slow, but we activate all these flexible, free-thinking minds, and over time, that curve becomes a U, and autocracies exist on an inverted U curve, and we outperform. So do you think that's still operative today, where our fundamental source of strength is our innovative entrepreneurial spirit that is the foundation of our economy?
Yes. Well, let me match your book with my book.
Oh, there we go.
Available on Amazon. Do you have a copy yet? I'll send it to you if not.
I don't know if I have a copy yet, but I will buy it, Matt. So don't worry about that.
Okay. Well, I can send you an autographed one as well. But I didn't know that about General MacArthur. I should have cited that in the book. But I think he's basically right. Democracy or autocracies can make these big, bold decisions, And sometimes if it's the right decision, that can pay off, but often it's the wrong decision. I talk in the book about Napoleon and Hitler invading Russia in winter. It was a big, bold decision, but it led to the end of their states and the end of their regimes. And yeah, democracies are fragmented, we can't agree on much, we're slow. But when, often when we're disagreeing, there's good reason for that. If the country is divided on an issue, it's maybe not obviously, there's not an obvious solution. When there's actually consensus, then I think we can get things done as well as any autocracy. And the Manhattan Project and building nuclear weapons in just about 2 years, I think is a good example of that. So yeah, China might be doing well out of the gate on artificial intelligence, but I think there's good reason to believe that over the long term, the United States and our democratic allies will do better.
This is such an important point that often our political inefficiency is a feature, not a bug of our system, right? I mean, when the country's divided, you shouldn't be able to ram through a Marshall Plan or a Manhattan Project for X, Y, Z. The whole point is to force this inefficient process of debate and forge consensus around difficult issues. I think that's very underappreciated.
Yeah, and another benefit is that you through that debate you get the pros and cons are kind of surfaced. National leaders, like yourself, have the benefit of hearing all sides of the debate before making decisions. If you're President Putin or President Xi with a couple of yes men around you, you throw out an idea and they say yes, sir. Is that really going to lead to good decisions? And I think the answer we've seen really for thousands of years is no. Having that debate, forcing society to come to a consensus leads to better outcomes in the long run than a strong man forcing something on the people.
Now, if I were going to push back on your argument, and I would never do that because you're smarter than I am, but I would probably start with the recognition that in contrast to the days of Douglas MacArthur and Freedom's Forge, our economy is in a very different position. And particularly what we're discovering right now with coronavirus is we have so many single points of failure in our much more complex supply chain, such that it's not easy for us to ramp up and mobilize and surge in a way we could during World War II. And then what's unique about this and what I think makes it difficult than the Cold War is a lot of those supply chains lead back to Beijing. So we find ourselves in a situation where the Chinese Communist Party can threaten to cut off exports and plunge us into a sea of coronavirus. How would you respond to that pushback?
You're exactly right. The world is very different than, I start the book with the Greco-Persian Wars 20 years ago. So the world has certainly changed since then. But I think some of these, fundamentals haven't changed. And so, yes, the United States is in a problematic situation right now. We're too dependent on China. But what's the best way to solve that? Is it to have, the White House say, okay, everybody out of China? Or is it rather that, private companies, hundreds, thousands of private companies recognize the risks of doing business in China. They realize they have economic incentive to move to India or to Mexico or wherever else. And we'll see. It's playing out right now. But I think the disaggregated decisions of many of these smart actors looking out for their own business interest will lead to a better result than the government imposing a top-down solution. Now, there is a role for government, I think, to, in key national security areas and pushing back against Chinese unfair trading practices. So there is a role for both, but I think there's also the danger in the government getting too involved, especially in the details of economic planning.
Did you have any disconfirming cases in your book? I mean, I should have read it before I interviewed you, but I didn't, Matt. Okay. I swear I will. Where you had an example of a relatively open democratic regime competing with a comparatively autocratic regime, and things did not work out well for the democracy.
It's a good question. The short answer, I think, is no. Because you don't have that many democracies throughout history. I think we sometimes forget that, but democracy was a relatively rare form of government really until 1945. So in the book, I start with Athens because it was the first democracy. I look at the Roman Republic, the first republic. When I was working on drafts of the book, I had some smart colleagues say, well, why don't you look at the Mongol Empire? That was a big, powerful autocracy. And that's true, but they didn't compete against democracies. So they could do well against other autocracies. But there are really no clear cases of an autocracy beating a democracy in a long-term competition. The only possible example is, what about World War II? What about Hitler running roughshod over Europe, beating the French, beating Great Britain? And I think the democracies were too slow to step up to Hitler. But in the end, the democracies won, in part because Great Britain and France had good relations with this democratic superpower across the Atlantic Ocean, the United States. And I argue that is an advantage of democracies. They tend to be better at winning allies. So no examples I can think of an autocracy clearly defeating an autocracy over the long run.
My own view on the question of allies is that while ally bashing is in vogue right now, our secret weapon in the competition against China is the fact that we have this network of allies. And in some ways, I don't think the Chinese Communist Party is interested in having allies. They want tributary or vassal states. Elaborate a little bit more on how you view the role of allies, specifically within the context of our competition with China.
Well, we basically agree. I would just take issue with one thing, which is I think the allies, the fact that we have all these allies, are a reflection of our domestic political system. I think we've seen the centuries that democracies are good alliance and coalition builders. Autocracies are really bad at this. So if you look at Athens, the Roman Republic, the Venetian Republic, they were all alliance builders, and the United States is as well. If you look at autocracies, on the other hand, they often fight with their so-called allies more than with the enemy. Just take Russia, for example. It fought Nazi Germany when it was aligned in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The major fighting of the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War was invading its own members, Hungary and Czechoslovakia. Russia and China had an alliance, and they nearly fought a nuclear war in 1969. Georgia and Ukraine were members of this Commonwealth of Independent States that Russia set up, and then it invaded them. So I think autocracies can't do this. This is something that democracies do well. What is the benefit for us? If you look at GDP, share of global economic strength, a good measure of power, United States is currently 23% of global GDP. China's 15%, so that starts to get too close for comfort. If you add in U.S. allies to that, just formal treaty allies in Europe and Asia, our share goes to 59%. So if we can get our allies on board, it's not just us across the table from China, it's us with the Europeans and Japan sitting across the table with China. I think we have the preponderance of power to basically dictate terms to Beijing.
When you say our skill at building alliances is a reflection of our domestic political system, do you mean that because our domestic political system forces its own version of alliance building in order to get anything done legislatively, that we're better able to do a version of that internationally, or am I getting that wrong?
I think it's partly that. I think it's also partly that, political science, I'm a political science professor still. We don't have many useful findings, but I think one of the useful findings is that democracies are more likely to forge international agreements, and we're more likely to actually live up to those agreements. Just think about Russia. It cheats on all of its international agreements. It cheats on its arms control treaties. It says it's not going to invade Ukraine, and then it invades Ukraine. And it's the same thing with alliances. Democracies, because we're constrained, even if a president wants to tear up an alliance, it's not that easy. He's got resistance in the executive branch, resistance in Congress, resistance from the public. And so that means that democracies tend to actually chart a more steady course internationally. And so this is another thing that's counterintuitive too. Many people will say, well, China can strategically plan for the long term because it has a dictator. I think actually dictators, because they're unconstrained, can jerk their country in radically different directions. But because democratic leaders are more constrained, they tend to chart a steadier course. When they make alliance commitments, they tend to keep them. So I think international partners see the United States as more trustworthy than Russia or China.
So it's funny you bring this up. I reminded of a time, I think a year ago, I was doing an interview on Morning Joe, and I think they had expected me to come on as like a sacrificial lamb. And they were asking me about North Korea. And I was candid about the fact that if I remember this correctly, disagreed with something the administration was doing on North Korea, or basically said that I thought we had taken 2 steps forward, 1 step back, maximum pressure, good, but then we're doing all this other stuff to not impose maximum pressure. And then they said something effective. Well, aren't you worried about disagreeing with the president that you're going to get punished? And I reached back into the only thing I remember from political science, and I said something like, you know what? There's actually robust literature on the nature of two-level games. And I
Wow.
actually think we improve the president's negotiating position by driving a hard bargain in Congress. So that was the culmination of all of my time spent in graduate school. It got me out in a Morning Joe interview. I don't even know if I used that right, by the way.
No, that was great. And Professor Robert Putnam, who came up with two-levered games, that's probably the best citation he ever received. So.
I'm sure. Okay, if I were going to quibble further with your argument, I might point out the fact that everything you say about our democracy, our proud democracy in America, is true. However, the modern Congress has changed in meaningful ways. The modern Congress, which is supposed to be this arena where compromise happens, where debate happens, where we inefficiently work through problems, has really become a shell of its former self, and everything is now outsourced to the executive branch. Do you get into sort of the nature of Congress in your book at all? Does that worry you just on a personal level at all?
Well, you're the expert on Congress, and I know you're doing some good work to try to reform and improve the institution. And so I'll defer to you on that. I think that's probably right. But there still is despite all the flaws in the United States and with Congress, there's still a big difference between the way we make decisions and the way China makes decisions. And some people say, well, we can't forge consensus anymore, and maybe it's harder. But look at the China debate, for example. I think there is strong bipartisan consensus in Congress that this is a problem, that we need to do something about it. Machiavelli, the classic Italian political thinker. I don't know if you or your viewers are fans of Machiavelli, but people think of him as the author of The Prince. This book about basically a handbook on how to be a good dictator. But actually, Machiavelli was a fan of republics. And he said, people look at the Roman Republic and said it was so messy and there were always these intense fights and they couldn't compromise. And he said, that's what made Rome great. And so this is often my response when people talk about the kind of gridlock in Congress. This is what makes us great. It's hard to get anything done, but when we do agree on something, then that's really when we should be doing something, and we can get things done in those situations.
So is that in The Prince, or is it in Discourses on Livy, or where does he talk about that?
Okay, yeah. So you're a Machiavelli scholar. Discourses on Livy, which I think is the better book. And part of the reason I know this, one of my hardship posts at Georgetown, is I teach a 2-week course on Machiavelli in Florence, Italy, every May. Well, every May that there's not a pandemic, anyway.
So Machiavelli gets a bad rap, is basically what you're saying. There's a lot of nuance in it. Interesting enough, one of your intellectual heroes, Kissinger, referred to a great Wisconsinite, Mel Laird, who was Secretary of Defense in the Nixon administration, as the Midwest Machiavelli, and he had respect for Laird because he was usually the only person who could outmaneuver him bureaucratically. Interesting point. I'm reminded of a speech that Reagan gave at Fudan University in China midway through his administration. And he has this great point where he's talking to these Chinese students about the nature of American democracy. And he said, we are a government that is elected by the vote of the people. This is how we choose our Congress and our president. We say of our country, here the people rule, and it is so. And I just think that's a very simple and powerful way to express a version of what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's great. And, I draw on many of these Democratic leaders throughout history, and Reagan, certainly a hero of mine.
Okay, so you talked a little bit about this emerging bipartisan consensus on China. Well, first of all, do you believe that there was a bipartisan consensus in the Cold War, that politics stopped at the water's edge?
Well, again, you may be the better expert on this than me, given your work on Truman. I mean, I think there was a consensus on. Actually, in the book, I argue there's basically been a consensus on U.S. grand strategy since 1945, and it's been, create geopolitical stability in Europe and Asia through our alliances, promote free markets in our sphere of influence, both at home and internationally. Promote democracy and freedom, and then to defend that system from those who would challenge it. Autocratic great powers like the Soviet Union back then, like Russia and China today. So I would argue that we've basically had the same grand strategy, bipartisan consensus for 70 years. But of course, those are the broad strokes. There's been a lot of disagreement on the details in the Cold War and even to today.
So in this new Cold War, I do think there is a emerging consensus, or at least the solidifying of the hawkish position on China, for lack of a better descriptor. What do you see certain fault lines emerging, though, both between the parties or within various parties? What do you think are going to be the major debates within this question of how do we compete successfully against China?
It's a good question. One of them I wrote about just today, actually. I had an article in Foreign Policy magazine. And you have some people arguing that maybe we should try to cozy up to Russia to counter China. We kind of did the reverse during the Cold War. We worked with China against Russia. And some people, including reportedly Henry Kissinger, are saying we should do the same thing. What I argue in this piece is I think that doesn't make sense, that instead we should work with our existing allies and beat both of them at the same time. But I think there may be some who would say, we should try to improve relations with Russia to beat China.
And why do you think it's misguided to work with Russia to balance against a rising China?
Well, I think there are a few reasons. One, I don't think it's possible. Putin's foremost goal is to undermine U.S. interest. I don't think Putin wants to turn against China. They have some areas of mutual interest. I think it's going to be hard to turn him away from that. If we even tried, he would demand concessions that I think are not in our interests, like limiting missile defense. And I don't think Russia brings that much to the table. Its GDP is smaller than Italy's. It's a declining power. So why work that hard to get 2% of GDP when, as I said before, we already have 60% of GDP if we just work with our existing allies. So I think the better approach is to work with existing allies to beat them both at the same time.
But we do have to be conscious about not driving Russia into the arms of China and having them balance against us. I mean, as you alluded to before, these would be strange bedfellows because they almost fought a nuclear war in '69. Their interests are not aligned in Asia. But are you concerned about any rapprochement between Russia and China or increased cooperation against the United States?
Well, I think there is a lot of evidence that they are cooperating more. The best example is they're conducting joint military exercises in Europe and Asia. And that is concerning, to be sure. I mean, if Europe was at war with Russia at the same time that China invaded Taiwan, the U.S. military and our alliance system would be greatly stretched. So I'm not saying it's not a concern. I just don't think that working with Russia is really a feasible option or a way to deal with that. So I think it's rather we have to try to manage the Russia problem, even as we counter China, which I think is the greater threat.
So the irony of all this is you started off your career inspired by Kissinger's example, and now you're in the midst of destroying his signal foreign policy achievement, which was the opening of China. Although Kissinger has admitted, I don't know if he meant this critically, but he said we're on the foothills of a new Cold War. I'd be curious if his views have evolved in recent years.
And I would think that Kissinger and many of these people who've been advocating for an opening with China for decades, many of them have admitted that their bets were wrong, that they assumed that by embracing China, that it would become, partner with the United States, more of a responsible international player, and those bets haven't turned out. I think over the long run, anyway, that move by Kissinger didn't pay off.
Okay, so what's your next project before we transition into more fun subjects in our remaining 10 minutes?
Yeah, well, I have a lot I want to do, but my next big book project, I think, is going to be on this U.S.-led international system over the last 75 years. And as you know, IR theorists debate, why has there been peace over the past 70 years? Why has there been globalization over the past 70 years? Why has there been a spread of democracy over the past 70 years? And they give little narrow answers for each. Well, peace is because of nuclear weapons, and globalization is because of technology and the WTO, many other things. Democracy is because of norms and norm entrepreneurs and other things. And the argument of my book is going to be, no, essentially political scientists have been wrong for decades. It's American power that's caused all of these things. It's American power that's caused the peace. It's American power that's caused the globalization, that's pushed for open markets. It's American power that's pushed for democracy and good governance around the world. And these other narrow things that people are focusing on are really themselves just reflections of American power.
How would you relate that argument to arguments, let's say, of William Wilforth for the stability of unipolar systems, particularly when the unipole is the U.S., and also some of Robert Kagan's work on the nature of American power?
I'd say it's very similar to Kagan's in particular. But I think what I have in mind is something a little bit more academic, something that would speak to the other political scientists, using some of the statistics and other things that would persuade them. Because Kagan, I think, was really speaking to a popular audience and persuaded a lot of people. But I think persuading the academics and getting this idea taught in the classrooms would be helpful. I don't know about you, but, studying political science, I was never taught about the U.S.-led international system. But I really think it's a more helpful framework for thinking about the world.
Well, we'll look forward to that. What did Kissinger say about academia? The fights are so intense because the stakes are so small.
Exactly.
Okay, so you don't spend all of your time writing, intense academic books. Presumably, you have fun. When you're not, writing, what do you do? Do you have any guilty, lowbrow TV obsessions or movie obsessions? What do you do to unwind?
Yeah. Well, like you, I've got a fairly new, a young family. I got married a few years ago. And now we have a couple of kids. So I've got a 3-year-old daughter and a 3-month-old son. And so when I'm not at work, usually it's a fire drill, trying to get dinner prepared and clean up and bedtime. So that's a lot of fun, but a lot of work. But when I do unwind, we've been watching Veep recently. I actually never saw that the first time around. So we're enjoying that. I'm sure that's the way Congress really works. Do you know Jonah Ryan?
I actually think Veep is the best analysis of how Congress works. Better than The West Wing, better than anything serious. I mean, there's just a deep undercurrent of truth in that show. Okay, so with young kids, this is a question I need to get an answer to. How do you carve out time to write? Do you do all your actual work at the office, or do you wake up super early? What's your process for balancing these things?
Well, it's changed. When I was single, I would sleep in, go to the gym, go to work, write in the evenings. But that's not possible anymore. So I've forced myself to become a morning person. So I set my alarm at 5:30 every day. Back when we used to go to an office before COVID, I would be in the office by 6:30. And I'd write from 6:30 to 9:30 every morning. And, and then by 9:30 it was teaching, meetings, phone calls, emails, and then home at night with the family. And so it might not sound like much, but if you can actually devote 3 hours a day to writing and to big substantive projects, you can actually get quite a bit done.
This is a common theme emerging on this podcast. One of your colleagues, Oriana Mastro, is an evangelist for what she calls sacred writing time, or former colleagues, I should say. But this has actually been transformative in my own life. Just the ability to wake up early and tackle your most important task right away before you're on defense, I found to pay dividends.
Yeah, I think that's right. If you get the most important thing done first thing, then no matter what happens the rest of the day, you can consider it a successful day.
Okay. What do you read fiction?
I do, but much less than I would like. You know, it's I don't know.
Because you feel guilty when you're reading it, like you should be reading some obscure APSA paper or the latest edition of International Security or something.
Well, first, I have always enjoyed nonfiction more, and so one of the things I've been reading recently that I've been enjoying is "Present at the Creation" by Dean Acheson. Something I know you've probably read many times over the years, given your research. So I have always enjoyed history, so I prefer that. But yeah, part of the reason is just, there are only so many hours in the day, and I'm stretched pretty thin. So I haven't been able to carve out time for as much fiction as I would like.
Okay. And I'm coming to you from my basement. If you went upstairs, you would see a variety of infant gear, as I would call it. Is there a particular gadget that you swear by that you would recommend to someone who's going to be a father for the first time?
And when are you expecting?
June 27th.
Oh, wow. So only a month away.
It's getting real.
Yeah. Do you know if it's a boy or a girl, or?
We do not know. We're going to be surprised.
Wow. Well, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Gadgets. A wife is helpful.
Okay.
You got that secure.
That's good. It's a team approach.
Yeah. Couldn't do it without her.
Do you have strong thoughts about strollers, baby Bjorns, things like that, or it's just? Do you guys use a snoo?
No, we don't have a snoo, but the baby Bjorn, that's the thing where you kind of strap them on and walk around. That's nice. I like that. Because a stroller is so cumbersome. You've got to put it in the car and get it out, push it over gravel. If they're just strapped onto you, you can kind of go about your day. So,
do you ever do your writing time with the baby strapped on to you? Was that ever an option?
I haven't done that yet, but that's, I think I'd be lucky enough somehow.
Final question. Let's say you come to visit us in Green Bay. We're out at a local watering hole having a beer, and a kid comes up to you and says, Professor Kroenig, I love your work. I'm really interested in pursuing a career in academia and foreign policy. What advice would you have for that young Wisconsinite?
Well, first I'd say, what are you doing at a bar at this young age? Stop the drinking.
It's allowed in Wisconsin if you're with your parents. You can be under 18 and at a bar. It's a quirk. It's an interesting quirk. From 18 to 21, you can't. But if you're with your parents below 18, you can be at a bar and drink.
That's interesting. Well, I'd say I think set some goals and be ambitious about it. And you might not achieve them, but if you're aiming high, that's better than aiming low. And I'd say be strategic about it, and look at the careers of people you admire, like Kissinger, like Congressman Gallagher. Look at the path that they took, and then see what a successful model looks like, and then think about whether that's the kind of career path that you would like to have. So I think it's never going to be exactly how you plan, but I think having a plan is important, and thinking about what you're aiming for and what some of the major steps might be for you to get there.
Awesome. Great advice. Remind us the title of the book and where people can find it.
It is The Return of Great Power Rivalry, Democracy versus Autocracy from the Ancient World to the U.S. and China. And it's available on Amazon, local bookstores. So I hope I had a lot of fun writing it. I hope people enjoy reading it.
Fantastic. Well, Matt Kroenig, thanks for joining us. Thanks for helping us take a new look at a variety of foreign policy issues, and look forward to seeing you in person soon.
It was my pleasure. Look forward to seeing you soon, and congratulations again on impending fatherhood. It's an exciting.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. I'm terrified.
The dude about, yeah. The dude about. The dude about, yeah. The dude